What if I told you that on the day Jesus Christ died on the cross, halfway across the world in ancient Ireland, a king turned to his most trusted advisor and asked, "Why has darkness covered the entire earth?" What if the advisor, a Druid high priest, actually knew the answer? Today, we're diving into one of history's most fascinating mysteries, the stunning possibility that Irish Druids not only knew about Christ's crucifixion as it happened, but may have been visited by the very same Magi, the wise men from the East, who brought gifts to the baby Jesus. This isn't fiction, this is documented Irish history, preserved for nearly 2,000 years. So here's the question we're going to answer today. Were the ancient Druids of Ireland actually part of the Christian story, connected to the biblical Magi, and aware of Christ's mission on earth? Let's find out. Welcome to Uncovered Biblical History and Traditions, the channel dedicated to lost stories of the biblical past. Discover stories of pre-Christian historical roots, biblical legends, lost church history, and forgotten historical characters of faith. It is very helpful if you hit the like, subscribe, and share. Help build my channel, and let's take a look together into these uncovered forgotten tales. When most people hear the word Druid, they picture mysterious forest dwellers, perhaps engaging in dark rituals. But what if everything we've been taught is wrong? Here's something that will blow your mind. Early Irish writers didn't call these priests Druids alone. They used another term, Magi. Yes, the exact same word used in the Bible for the wise men who followed the star to Bethlehem. The Latin term, Magi, was the standard equivalent for Druids in ancient Irish texts. Welsh writers used it constantly. It wasn't metaphorical, it was literal. James Heron, a respected doctor of divinity, documented this explicitly, referring to a sacred caste in Ireland called Druida or Magi. The spiritual leaders of Ireland held the same title as the men who knelt before the infant Christ. This wasn't an accident of translation. This was recognition of a shared spiritual authority spanning continents. The term, Magi, conjures up images of wisdom, prophecy, and divine knowledge. Yet somehow, over centuries, the Druids have been stripped of this sacred identity in modern consciousness. We've lost the understanding that our ancestors possessed, that these were holy men, not pagans in the way we've been led to believe. Now, here's where the story gets absolutely incredible. The Gospel of Matthew tells us that after the Magi visited Jesus, they departed into their own country another way. But where exactly did they go? Consider this: Britain was the acknowledged headquarters of Druidism in the ancient world. It was the Vatican of the Druidic world, if you will. Now, imagine you're one of the Magi. You've just witnessed the fulfillment of ancient prophecies. You've seen the Messiah with your own eyes. Wouldn't you want to share this earth-shattering news with your fellow spiritual leaders? The possibility isn't just plausible, it's logical. These Magi would have every reason to visit Britain and Ireland to share their testimony with the Druidic counterparts. If Druids and Magi were truly the same priestly order, separated only by geography, then this journey becomes not just possible but probable. Think about the timing. The Magi visited Jesus around 4 BC to 1 AD. Now jump forward roughly 30 to 40 years, to approximately 33 AD, the year of the Crucifixion. This is where Irish history becomes absolutely stunning. The records speak of Conor Macnessa, King of Ulster, who died in 48 AD, just 15 years after Christ's crucifixion. This wasn't some legendary figure lost in the mists of time. This was a historical king with a documented death date, ruling during the exact period when Christianity was being born. And this king had a chief druid named Beacric. On the day of the crucifixion, something unprecedented happened. The Bible records it clearly: darkness fell over the entire earth. In Luke's Gospel, chapter 23, verse 44, it's documented that this darkness covered all the earth. In Ireland, thousands of miles from Jerusalem, King Conor Macnessa witnessed this darkness and turned to his highest spiritual advisor demanding an explanation. Here's what makes this account so powerful. Irish historians have repeated this story consistently for nearly 2,000 years. Generation after generation, the Irish have maintained that their chief druid knew exactly what was happening in Palestine at that very moment. But how? How could a druid in Ireland know about events in Jerusalem in real time? This was centuries before any modern means of communication. The journey from Palestine to Ireland would have taken months by sea. The answer brings us back to the Magi. It's entirely probable that Druid Beorhtric received his knowledge from visiting Druids or Magi, who had travelled from the east. Perhaps these were the very same Magi who had seen the infant Jesus, or their successors who carried the prophecies and understood the timeline. They would have known the prophecies about the Messiah's death. They would have been watching for the signs. And when the darkness fell, they knew exactly what it meant. To understand why this connection matters, we need to grasp who the Druids actually were in Irish society. According to the scholar John Toland, the Druids held an extraordinary position. They were exempt from military service, they never bore arms. Yet paradoxically, their word was final in all matters of war and peace. Kings consulted them before every major decision. They didn't fight battles, but they determined whether battles would be fought at all. These weren't mere advisors, they were the ultimate authorities on matters of life and death. Many Druids were sons of kings. Great numbers came from the aristocracy. This wasn't a fringe religious movement, this was the spiritual establishment of Celtic society, integrated into the highest levels of power. Their very clothing reflected their sacred status. Druids wore white surplices during religious ceremonies and had the privilege of wearing 6 colors in their robes. Only the king and queen could wear more, 7 colors. This was law, established in 1383 BC under King Achias I. Lords and ladies wore 5 colors, fortress governors 4, officers 3, soldiers 2, and common people just 1. The Druids stood at 6, a clear signal of their exalted position, just below royalty. But the Druids' role went far beyond political advisory. They were the keepers of knowledge, the preservers of truth, the guardians of history itself. John Toland, writing in 1720, made an observation that should stun us. The Irish have incomparably more ancient material for their history than either the English or the French or any other European nation with whose manuscripts I have any acquaintance. More ancient than England, more ancient than France, more comprehensive documentation than any European nation he had studied. The Irish were, strangely solicitous, if not in some degree superstitious, about preserving their books and parchments. They went to extraordinary lengths to protect the documents, even hiding them underground during times of danger. Unfortunately, many precious manuscripts perished because those hiding them lacked the technical knowledge to preserve them properly. Their love for preservation actually led to loss, a tragic irony. But what survived is remarkable. The Druids wrote the most valuable pieces, both in verse and prose. These texts contained their rites and religious formularies, their understanding of divinity and philosophy, and the 2 grand doctrines, the eternity and incorruptibility of the universe. These weren't primitive superstitions, these were sophisticated theological and cosmological concepts, preserved with care and reverence. Even more fascinating is what happened to Druidic law. They called their legal system the celestial judgments, a name that speaks to divine origin. These weren't merely human laws, they claimed heavenly warrant. For centuries, these laws existed only in oral form, preserved in traditional poems according to Druidic institution. This was deliberate. The Druids believed in the power of memory, in the discipline of committing truth to the mind rather than to parchment. Memorization was sacred practice. But in 48 AD, 15 years after the Crucifixion, the very year that King Conor Macnessa died, these laws were finally committed to writing by the king's command. The same king who had witnessed the darkness on the day Christ died. The same king whose chief druid had explained the cosmic significance of that moment. Is this timing coincidental? A king who understood that something profound had happened in Palestine decides to preserve the sacred laws in permanent written form. It's as if he understood that an old era was ending and a new one beginning, and he wanted to ensure that the wisdom of the old ways survived the transition. The Druids' commitment to learning bore remarkable fruit. Ireland produced scholars whose influence extended across Europe. Vigil, known as Vigilius the geometer, affirmed that the earth was round, centuries before this became common knowledge. Sedulius wrote sophisticated treatises on grammar, government, and theology in the 8th century. Irish scholars were so respected that Charlemagne himself employed them. Clement worked alongside the famous Alcuin at Charlemagne's court. Dicuil wrote Liber de Mensura Terrae, a geographical work demonstrating the breadth of Irish learning. This intellectual tradition grew from the Druidic emphasis on knowledge and memory. Even after Christianity established itself in Ireland, this tradition continued. The Assembly of Drumkeet in 575 AD formalized support for poets and historians, establishing public schools to preserve genealogies, history, and linguistic purity. Saint Columba himself attended this assembly, advocating for the Irish bards. The sacred tradition of knowledge preservation, begun by the Druids, continued under Christian auspices. So, let's return to our opening question. Were the ancient Druids of Ireland actually part of the Christian story, connected to the biblical Magi, and aware of Christ's mission on earth? The evidence suggests something remarkable. The Druids were indeed called Magi, the same title as the biblical wise men. The possibility that these Eastern Magi visited Ireland after seeing Christ is not only plausible but logical, given Britain's status as Druidism's headquarters. And most compelling of all, Irish historical tradition consistently maintains that when darkness fell on the day of crucifixion, a Druid in Ireland knew exactly what it meant. This isn't about proving beyond doubt that Irish Druids were Christians before Christianity officially reached Ireland. It's about recognizing that the ancient world was more connected than we imagine, that spiritual truth traveled along paths we've forgotten, and that the Druids were learned, sacred men who may well have recognized the cosmic significance of Christ's death and resurrection. If you would like further context and the rest of the story, check out previous videos and future videos. If you would like more information where to research this subject, pause this image and look into these resources or find resources in description. If you have book sources or links of your own on this subject, please share in comments or email me. Thank you. What if 130 books, containing the accumulated wisdom of centuries, were deliberately set ablaze in a single, catastrophic act of cultural erasure? What knowledge died in those flames? What innovations, what philosophies, what healing arts vanished forever into ash and smoke? This isn't a hypothetical question. It actually happened in 5th century Ireland, when St. Patrick's missionaries encountered the ancient Druids, the keeper scholars of Celtic wisdom. Today, we're diving into one of history's most fascinating and tragic collisions between two powerful systems of belief, the mystical world of the Irish Druids and the rising tide of Christianity. What began as a meeting of minds became a battle for souls, and the consequences of that clash still echo through the centuries. To understand what was lost, we first need to understand what the Druids had built. Picture Ireland in the centuries before Christianity, a land where knowledge wasn't just valued, it was sacred. The Druids weren't merely priests or religious figures. They were the architects of an entire civilization's intellectual life, combining the roles of philosopher, scientist, lawyer, historian, and spiritual guide all in one. Writing in 1720, the scholar John Toland made a remarkable observation. He stated that the Irish possessed incomparably more ancient materials for their history than the English, the French, or any other European nation whose manuscripts he had examined. And Toland wasn't some provincial scholar with limited exposure, he had studied documents across the continent. Yet he found that nothing compared to the depth and antiquity of Irish records. The Irish, he noted, had been almost superstitiously careful about preserving their books and parchments, even those that had become partially unintelligible with age. But here's the tragedy within Toland's observation, that very over-carefulness sometimes led to loss. Abundance of documents perished underground, hidden by people who lacked the skill to preserve them properly. They were so desperate to protect their precious texts that they buried them in the earth, only to have moisture and time do what they feared human hands might do. What made these documents so valuable? The most important pieces, both in verse and prose, had been written by the Druids themselves. These weren't simple religious texts. They contained the rites and formularies of Druidic practice, their understanding of divinity and philosophy, and the two grand doctrines, the eternity and incorruptibility of the universe. Imagine a worldview that saw the cosmos not as a temporary creation but as an eternal, indestructible reality. This was revolutionary thinking, sophisticated philosophy that placed the Druids among the great thinkers of the ancient world. The Druids also created Ireland's legal system. Their laws were called celestial judgments, a name that reveals how they saw jurisprudence not as human invention but as divine principle. For generations, these laws existed only in traditionary poems, memorized and passed down according to Druidic custom. It wasn't until 48 AD that King Conor Macnessa of Ulster commanded these oral traditions be committed to writing. Think about that, a legal system so sophisticated it governed a complex society, yet maintained purely through the power of memory and poetry. The relationship between Irish royalty and their learned class reveals something profound about this society. Three kings, in particular, stand out as champions of knowledge. First came King Achius in 1383 BC, that's over 3,000 years ago, who earned the title, the Doctor of Ireland. He didn't just patronize learning, he institutionalized it. At Tara, the ancient ceremonial center of Irish power, he built an academy called the Court of the Learned. But Achius went further. He ordained that every principal family should have hereditary antiquaries, professional historians and record keepers. If the hereditary line produced someone incapable, the position would go to the most able person from that historical house. These antiquaries were granted ranks and privileges immediately after the Druids themselves, showing how highly this society valued those who preserved knowledge. Centuries later, King Tuathalius in the 1st century AD created what we might call history's first peer review system. He appointed a committee, 3 kings or great lords, 3 druids, and 3 antiquaries, to conduct a triennial revision of all historical books. Whatever they approved as valuable was transcribed into the Royal Book of Tara. Imagine that, a systematic, recurring process for verifying and preserving knowledge, all organized over 2,000 years ago. Then came King Cormac in 266 AD. He renewed the laws about antiquaries, rebuilt and enlarged the academy at Tara, expanding it to include not just history but law and military training. Cormac himself was an indefatigable distributor of justice who wrote numerous laws, many of which still existed when Toland was writing 14 centuries later. This was a civilization that believed in documentation, in preservation, in the transmission of wisdom across generations. So when St. Patrick arrived in Ireland in the 5th century, it encountered something far more sophisticated than simple paganism. It met a fully developed intellectual tradition with its own complex theology, its own sophisticated legal system, its own educational institutions. What happened next is where our story becomes complicated and heartbreaking. Some Druids accepted Christianity and transitioned smoothly into the new order. Where a Druid embraced the new religion, he became a bishop or priest. The similarities between the two systems made this possible. Both had hierarchical structures, both valued learning, both concerned themselves with spiritual and moral guidance. In many ways, the Druid converting to Christianity simply changed the content of his beliefs while maintaining his social function. Also, Christianity may have already existed in some form from the influence of the Glastonbury Culdee missionaries. But great numbers of Druids didn't convert. Here's what's fascinating, they didn't need to. For a long time after the English conquest, we're talking centuries later, judges, bards, physicians, and harpers continued to hold the same hereditary tenures they'd held in pre-Christian times. Families like the Oduvagans remained hereditary bards. The O'Clerys and O'Brodens continued as hereditary antiquaries. The O'Shiels and O'Canvans maintained their positions as hereditary physicians. The Maclanchys stayed on as hereditary judges. The old system persisted alongside the new faith, a remarkable example of cultural continuity. But not everyone in the Christian establishment was content with coexistence. This is where we return to those 130 volumes. According to a letter from Dudley Forbes to an Irish writer, St. Patrick's missionaries burned at least 130 books relating to the Druids. 130 volumes. In an era when each book represented months or years of painstaking hand copying, when knowledge was rare and precious, when the accumulated wisdom of generations resided in these texts, they were set ablaze. Forbes didn't mince words about what this meant. He called it a deplorable extinction of arts and inventions, an unspeakable detriment to learning, and a dishonor upon human understanding. But notice his most damning phrase. He blamed the cowardly proceeding of the ignorant, or rather the interested. Not just ignorant people acting out of simple misunderstanding, but interested parties, people with something to gain from destroying competing sources of authority and knowledge. What was in those books? We'll never fully know. Certainly, religious material that contradicted Christian teaching. But also, likely, practical knowledge, medical treatments, astronomical observations, agricultural techniques, legal precedents, historical records, philosophical arguments, perhaps even technological innovations. When you burn books, you don't just destroy ideas you disagree with. You destroy everything they contain, the irreplaceable alongside the objectionable. This pattern of Christian suppression of Druidic knowledge wasn't unique to Ireland, but the Irish experience is particularly well documented. And here's the cruel irony: Christianity itself was a religion of the book, a faith that valued scripture and learning. Yet in its zeal to establish itself, it destroyed the books of those who came before. The story has an interesting coda, one that brings us forward to the 19th century. Thomas More, the celebrated Irish poet, was commissioned to write a history of Ireland. Initially, More spoke dismissively about the value of ancient Irish manuscripts. He seems to have assumed they were primitive, unreliable, perhaps even fabricated. Then in 1839, More visited the Royal Irish Academy with Dr. Petrie. He was shown a collection of ancient books relevant to historical research. After briefly examining these massive tomes, More turned to his companion and said something remarkable. "Petrie, these huge tomes could not have been written by fools or for any foolish purpose. I never knew anything about them before, and I had no right to have undertaken the history of Ireland." It was a moment of devastating self-awareness. Here was a man celebrated for his Irish identity, commissioned to write his nation's history, suddenly confronted with the depth of his own ignorance. From that day forward, More reportedly lost all enthusiasm for his project. He completed the remaining volume only because his publishers pressured him to finish what he'd started. More's experience reveals something important about historical memory. By the 19th century, even educated Irish people had lost touch with the sophistication of their own ancient culture. The centuries of colonial rule, the suppression of native learning, the elevation of English over Irish, all of it had severed the connection between modern Ireland and its Druidic past. When More finally saw the actual manuscripts, the physical evidence of that lost civilization, he realized how much had been forgotten. So let's return to our opening question: what was lost when those 130 books burned? We can't fully answer that, and that's precisely the point. We can't know what innovations, what wisdom, what insights died in those flames. We know the Druids had sophisticated astronomical knowledge. It's hinted at in the structures they built and the festivals they timed to celestial events. We know they had medical expertise. The hereditary physician families suggest a well-developed healing tradition. We know they had complex philosophy. Their ideas about the eternal, incorruptible universe indicate deep metaphysical thinking. But the specifics, the details, the actual content of their thought, much of that is gone forever, smoke on the wind. Imagine this: it's the year 1746 in County Limerick, Ireland. Twice a year, a gathering takes place that has occurred without interruption for over 1,000 years. The participants don't wear robes or carry staffs. They're not performing mysterious rituals in stone circles. Yet they are the direct descendants of one of history's most enigmatic groups, the Druids of ancient Ireland. This gathering represents the final gasp of a tradition that somehow survived the fall of Rome, the spread of Christianity, and the conquest of Ireland by foreign powers. But here's the question that will guide our journey today: how did a supposedly pagan religious order not only survive the Christianization of Ireland but actually transform itself so successfully that its members became the backbone of Irish society for more than a millennium? The answer reveals one of history's most fascinating stories of cultural adaptation, hidden continuity, and the surprising connections between ancient Ireland and the civilizations of the Middle East. When Christianity swept across Ireland in the 5th and 6th centuries, most historians assumed the Druids simply vanished, replaced by monks and priests. The reality was far more complex and intriguing. Rather than disappearing, the Druidic class underwent a remarkable metamorphosis. They didn't fight the new religion, they merged with it, adapted to it, and in many ways, shaped it to preserve their own traditions. The bards were the first to demonstrate this survival strategy. These poets, storytellers, and keepers of cultural memory had always formed a crucial part of the Druidic hierarchy. When the old religious structures crumbled, the bards simply continued their work under new patronage. They maintained their ancient honors and special privileges in communities throughout Ireland. Their status remained so secure that they operated openly and officially well into the Elizabethan era, some surviving until the mid-18th century. That County Limerick gathering in 1746 wasn't an isolated pocket of resistance, it was the endpoint of a continuous tradition stretching back into prehistory. But the bards were just one thread in this tapestry of survival. Perhaps even more significant were the judges, known in English as the Brehons. The term itself comes from the Celtic word, brethamaige, meaning judge, and these legal experts represented a direct institutional succession from the Druidic order. When religious authority shifted to the Christian Church, the Brehons retained the judicial functions, emerging as representatives who carried forward Ireland's ancient legal traditions under new terminology. Now, here's where the story takes a truly unexpected turn. The Brehon legal code wasn't just any medieval law system, it was arguably the most ancient legal framework in all of Europe, and its characteristics revealed something startling about Ireland's deep past. The Brehon Code was built on a patriarchal organizational model, with a complete governmental framework based on familial hierarchy. The legislative system structured around patriarchal principles bore striking resemblances to ancient legal traditions from far beyond Ireland's shores. Scholars examining these laws found evidence suggesting Eastern geographical origins, with connections to ancient Middle Eastern social structures that seemed impossible to dismiss as mere coincidence. The similarities to Jewish legal traditions were particularly compelling. Certain scholars went so far as to assert that portions of the Brehon Code appeared to replicate Mosaic legislation. The most specific parallel involved the law of the firstborn, the requirement for every creature's firstborn, including human children, to be presented to the Lord. This provision, documented in biblical passages like Exodus chapter 13 verse 2 and Numbers chapter 18 verse 15, appeared in remarkably similar form within the Brehon Code. But wait, there's more to this mystery. The linguistic evidence is equally intriguing. In Welsh, the designation for Irish people was Idu, while Ireland itself was called Idawan. Both terms relate directly to the concept of Jewsland. This wasn't just medieval wordplay. The Renaissance scholar Postelius, in his analysis of the 1st century chronicler Pomponius Mela, noted that Ireland was historically called Duran, essentially meaning Jewsland. The rationale: ancient peoples believed there had been a presence of Jewish people, identified as Israel, in Ireland, a people known as exceptional prophets and diviners who foresaw global dominion originating from these territories. Before dismissing this as medieval myth-making, consider the archaeological and historical evidence for Ireland's sophisticated ancient culture. The people who brought these legal traditions to Ireland, whether they came from the Middle East or acquired their knowledge through Mediterranean trade routes, didn't arrive empty-handed. They brought advanced knowledge and skills that would shape Irish civilization for millennia. According to Irish tradition, these ancient people, some sources identified them as the Tuatha Dé Danann, exercised authority throughout Ireland for approximately 200 years. During the governance, they demonstrated architectural mastery and advanced construction capabilities. Their sophisticated building techniques and proficiency in various crafts and skills exceeded anything previously seen on the island. Where did this expertise come from? The legends tell of extended residency in Greece, where knowledge was acquired during prolonged habitation. This Greek learning, arts and sciences alike, was then transferred to Ireland, creating a unique fusion of Mediterranean and Celtic cultures. Today, scholars have the opportunity for dispassionate review of genuine historical legal texts. They can study ancient Irish jurisprudence in authenticated format, and their evaluation findings are remarkable. The Brehon Code represents an exceptionally significant collection of ancient laws, archaic legal principles that maintain unusual integrity from their original precepts. The purity is striking. These laws remain remarkably uncontaminated from their source, showing a continuity that spanned both British and Irish territories. The sophistication of ancient Irish society extended far beyond law and governance. Recent archaeological discoveries have provided tangible evidence of advanced medical knowledge that would have been remarkable in any ancient civilization. Within Druidical burial mounds, known as tumuli, researchers have found human skeletal remains showing clear evidence of medical intervention. Bones displaying fractures had been professionally reset, and the evidence of successful healing processes demonstrates not just luck but genuine understanding of anatomy and medicine. This wasn't primitive first aid, it was organized medical practice in Druidic society. The legendary accounts provide even more specific evidence. Nuada, an early monarch in Irish history, suffered the loss of his hand during military combat. The medical response was extraordinary. Craidna, identified as an artificer or craftsman, created a prosthetic hand constructed from silver. But this wasn't just a decorative replacement, the fingers were engineered with mechanical movement capability, possessing articulation and mobility. Whether this legend reflects actual mechanical engineering or symbolic storytelling, it reveals a culture that valued medical innovation and technological advancement. The Druids formalized surgical practice in ways that anticipated modern military medicine. They established systematized surgical practitioners with designated responsibility for battlefield casualties. Their primary duty was providing medical care to combat wounded, and these medical practitioners were recruited directly from the Druid class. This meant that Druids served dual roles. They were both medical practitioners and surgeons, as well as historians and record keepers. Beyond medicine, they carried responsibilities for preservation of national history, documentation of royal lineages, and recording heroic achievements and deeds. This medical expertise was part of a broader technological sophistication. Ancient Ireland possessed naval resources, seafaring vessels that enabled trade and communication across significant distances. They maintained organized armed forces, demonstrating metalworking expertise across various metals and industrial production capabilities. This wasn't a primitive society struggling for survival. This was a civilization with complex organization, specialized knowledge, and institutional continuity. And that continuity is perhaps the most remarkable part of the story. When Christianity arrived, rather than destroying this ancient knowledge system, it absorbed it. The Druids who became Christian monks brought their learning with them. The medical practitioners continued healing. The judges continued adjudicating. The bards continued singing. The forms changed, the religious context transformed, but the essential knowledge and social functions persisted. This integration of Druidic practices into Christian Ireland wasn't perfect or complete. Much was lost, and the old religion did eventually fade. But specific roles survived: bards, judges, medical practitioners, each maintaining threads of the ancient tradition. The survival of these professional classes, maintaining specialized knowledge across centuries, represents one of history's most successful cultural adaptations. So what does all this tell us? The connections suggesting Eastern or Middle Eastern origins, the possible Jewish or Hebraic cultural influences, the Greek cultural transmission through the Tuatha De Danann, these aren't just curious footnotes. They reveal that ancient Ireland was far more connected to the wider world than we often imagine. The sophisticated legal systems predating other European codes, the advanced medical knowledge including surgery and prosthetics, the maritime capabilities and metallurgical expertise, all point to a society at the crossroads of multiple cultural influences. The Druids didn't disappear when their religious system declined. They transformed, adapted, and continued. Their knowledge became Ireland's knowledge. Their laws became Ireland's laws. Their medical practices became Irish medical practices. And their commitment to preserving historical records and cultural memory ensured that even when the old ways faded, the memory of them survived. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe for more great content. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. See you in the next video.